Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today, we explain Prophet Samuel 2, chapter 1 in a clear and simple way, step by step. We are picking up right at a massive turning point in history. We're talking about the immediate, chaotic aftermath of a huge national tragedy, where the entire leadership of Israel changes literally in a single day. It's a chapter full of raw emotion, surprise twists, and some of the most beautiful poetry in the text. So let's dive right into this. Here is our agenda for today. First, we'll look at the context and the dramatic arrival of a mysterious messenger. Second, we'll hear the Amalekite's story. Third, we'll examine David's intense grief and swift judgment. Fourth, we'll walk through his famous poem, The Lament of the Bow. And finally, we'll wrap up with some practical lessons and a quick recap. All right, let's get started with Section 1, Context and the Messenger. To really understand the heavy emotional weight of this opening, you have to know exactly where we are in the story. Verse 1 gives us the setting. It tells us that after the death of Saul, David had just returned from his own fierce battle, defeating the Amalekites. He heads to a town called Ziklag, and he stays there for 2 days. Now, imagine this scenario. David has been fighting his own grueling military campaign. He's exhausted. He's just settling back into his temporary base in Ziklag to catch his breath. For those 2 days, he is completely off the grid. He has absolutely no idea about the devastating, world-shattering events that have just unfolded up north in the war against the Philistines. He doesn't know that the entire landscape of Israel's leadership has just been wiped out. Then, suddenly, the quiet of Ziklag is shattered. Verses 2 through 4 describe this incredibly dramatic arrival. On the 3rd day, a man walks into town arriving directly from the Israelite military camp. And look at his appearance. His clothes are physically torn, and he has earth or dust on his head. Now, in the ancient world, you didn't just show up like this because you had a rough trip. These are the absolute, undeniable, universal signs of deep mourning and massive catastrophe. When this man reaches David, he literally falls to the ground to pay him honor. David takes one look at this distressing sight, and he urgently asks him, "Where have you come from?" The man looks up and replies, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." You can almost feel David's heart drop into his stomach. He demands, "What happened? Tell me." And the messenger delivers the crushing blow. He says, "The men fled from the battle, many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Let that sink in for a second. This is the exact moment the world just stopped spinning for David. King Saul, the man who had relentlessly hunted him for years, and Jonathan, David's absolute dearest, closest friend, are both gone. Just like that. Let's move to Section 2, the Amalekite story. David, being the sharp leader he is, doesn't just accept this shocking news at face value. In verses 5 through 10, he immediately interrogates this young man to figure out how he could possibly know for a fact that Saul and Jonathan are dead. The young man starts his explanation by giving David the location. He says, "I happen to be on Mount Gilboa." Mount Gilboa is the rugged, elevated mountain range where this horrific battle against the Philistines took place. It's really crucial to visualize this scene. It's high ground, it's chaotic, it's desperate, and it's where Israel's army was ultimately overwhelmed. By saying this, the young man is placing himself right in the epicenter of the absolute worst disaster in Israel's recent history. Now pay close attention to the exact sequence of events this man claims happened next on that battlefield. He tells David, "Look, I saw Saul leaning on his spear, with the enemy chariots and riders bearing down on him." According to this messenger, Saul turned around, saw him, and called out. The young man claims he answered, "Here I am, what can I do?" He says Saul asked who he was, and he identified himself as an Amalekite. Then, according to the story, Saul pleaded with him, "Stand over me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I'm still alive." So the Amalekite looks at David and says, "So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not possibly survive." But he doesn't just offer words. To prove his incredible story, he reveals the ultimate, undeniable evidence. He reaches into his belongings and pulls out the royal crown that was on Saul's head and the band that was on his arm, and he presents them right there to David. He brought the physical symbols of the kingship straight to the man he knows is next in line. This brings us to Section 3, Grief and Judgment. So, here is a crown of Israel, sitting right in front of David, hand-delivered by a foreigner. We transition now to the massive emotional pivot of the chapter, in verses 11 through 16. Verses 11 and 12 show us something so profound about David's true character. Faced with the crown, he doesn't reach out and grab it. He doesn't throw a party because his biggest rival is finally dead. No. The text says,
Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. This isn't a quick sigh of relief masked to sadness. This is agonizing, unhurried, devastating grief. It is a collective mourning by David and all his hardened warriors, and it lasts the entire day until evening. David is weeping for his enemy Saul, he's weeping for his brother-in-arms Jonathan, and he is weeping for the horrific loss suffered by the entire nation.
So the absolutely crucial point here is the stark, jarring contrast between what the Amalekite expected to happen and how David actually reacts. Think about it from the messenger's perspective. He brought the crown and the armband, clearly anticipating a huge, handsome reward. He thought he was doing David a favor by eliminating his greatest rival and delivering the kingship to him on a silver platter. His entire motive was opportunism. But David's reaction is entirely devoid of personal ambition. He is literally sick with heartbreak. And once that initial period of fasting and weeping concludes for the day, David's profound grief shifts gears. It turns into a severe, principled, and righteous anger. In verses 13 and 14, David steps up and interrogates the young man one last time. He asks him point blank, "Where are you from?" The man replies, "I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite." Then David asks him a piercing, terrifying question. "Why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" You see, to David, the king of Israel wasn't just a politician. It wasn't just a government job. It was a sacred, divinely appointed position. Saul was the Lord's anointed, meaning God himself had chosen him. The fact that a foreigner, and an Amalekite of all people, felt totally comfortable striking down God's chosen leader was completely appalling and offensive to David's deep sense of reverence. And David does not hesitate for a second. In verse 15, he calls over one of his men and orders him to strike the Amalekite down. The man is executed right there on the spot. Verse 16 explains David's strict zero-tolerance reasoning. He tells the dying man, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" David doesn't need to call witnesses. He acts purely on the man's own voluntary confession. By bragging that he killed the sacred king, the Amalekite condemned himself. David is sending a loud, clear message. Opportunistic murder and blatant disrespect for God's anointed will absolutely not be rewarded here. It will be punished with the ultimate severity. Now, section 4, the lament of the bow. We are shifting from the gritty, harsh reality of that interrogation and execution to the soaring emotional climax of the chapter. Starting in verse 17, David channels his overwhelming, complicated grief into a beautiful, heartbreaking poem known as the Lament of the Bow. But right before we read the words of the lament, verse 18 provides some fascinating background context. It tells us that David ordered that the men of Judah be actively taught this lament of the bow, and it specifically notes that it is written in the book of Jashar. What is the book of Jashar? It was an ancient historical record, kind of like a national anthology, that preserved important poems, songs, and events for the Israelites. David didn't just want to sit in his tent and mourn privately. He wanted the entire nation to learn this song. He wanted to memorialize Saul and Jonathan so that generations to come would never forget them. The lament begins in verse 19, and it starts with a cry of pure, unfiltered anguish. David sings, "Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen." That phrase right there, "how the mighty have fallen," becomes the echoing, tragic chorus of the entire poem. When he mentions the heights, he's talking about Mount Gilboa, that elevated, rocky battlefield where the catastrophic loss took place. The very glory and pride of the nation has been struck down in the dirt. In verse 20, David's thoughts immediately turn to the enemy. He sings, "Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice." Gath and Ashkelon were major, prominent Philistine cities. David is expressing this deep, protective dread. The very idea that Israel's bitter enemies are getting the news, that they are probably celebrating this tragedy and dancing in their streets over the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, adds an unbearable sting to his grief. He wishes he could just keep the news entirely hidden from them so they couldn't gloat. David's sorrow then turns outward to the actual physical landscape where the battle occurred. In verse 21, he declares, "O mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, nor fields that yield offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, no longer rubbed with oil." This is incredibly powerful. He is literally placing a poetic curse on the mountain itself. Because Gilboa was the site where the anointed king's shield was cast away, abandoned, and defiled, David demands that the land become totally barren. He wants it stripped of life-giving dew and rain, forever marked as a dead place by the tragedy it witnessed. The shield no longer rubbed with oil means it's discarded, rusting, its glory totally gone.
Now, verses 22 through 24 brilliantly illustrate David's extraordinary character. He actively praises Saul and Jonathan's military might and their tight bond. He says that in life they were loved and gracious, and in death they were not parted. He calls them swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. He even calls on the daughters of Israel to weep for Saul, reminding them that Saul clothed them in scarlet and finery and brought them wealth. Think about how wild this is. Saul spent years relentlessly, obsessively trying to hunt David down and kill him. But in this moment, David chooses to remember Saul's bravery. He remembers his effectiveness as a military leader and the prosperity he brought to the nation. He honors his fallen rival with just immense, unbelievable dignity. Finally, in verses 25 and 26, this grand public lament becomes deeply, painfully personal. David turns his focus entirely to his best friend. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. This captures the absolute raw devastation of losing a true kindred spirit. Their bond of brotherhood and loyalty transcended everything else in David's life. And David concludes the entire lament in verse 27 with one final sorrowful repetition. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. And that brings us to section 5, lessons and recap. We have just walked through this intense, dramatic chapter, verse by verse. Now, let's take a step back from the narrative to distill what we've learned strictly from the simple text and how these events apply to our own character today. Looking strictly at the literal events, the plain, simple Peshat meaning, we see 3 key ideas jump out. First, the immense importance of honoring the anointed position. David respected the office of the king, regardless of how terribly the man holding it had treated him personally. Second, opportunism is fatal. The Amalekite thought he could profit from a massive national tragedy by telling David what he assumed David wanted to hear, and it cost him his life. Third, true grief transcends personal gain. On paper, David had everything to gain politically from Saul's death, but his heart was entirely, genuinely focused on the tragic loss of life and leadership for Israel. So, what practical life lessons can we draw from David's exemplary behavior in this chapter to improve ourselves? Well, first, we really need to practice respect for those in positions of leadership, even if we strongly disagree with them or find ourselves totally at odds with them. Second, we must guard our hearts against celebrating an enemy's downfall. Rejoicing in someone else's destruction is a massive failure of character. David showed us that empathy and dignity are a much higher calling. And lastly, we should all strive to cultivate selfless, devoted friendships, the kind of pure, loyal brotherhood that David shared with Jonathan. To quickly recap our step-by-step walkthrough today, the chapter begins with David in Ziklag receiving a battered, dust-covered messenger who brings the catastrophic news of the deaths of Saul and Jonathan. This messenger, an Amalekite, claims he personally struck the killing blow to King Saul, fully expecting a handsome reward. Instead of rejoicing, David and his men plunge into deep, fasting mourning. Absolutely appalled that this man killed God's anointed leader, David orders his immediate execution. Finally, David composes the Lament of the Bow, a timeless, heartbreaking, and beautiful tribute honoring his fallen king and his beloved friend, forever cementing their legacy in the history of Israel.
It really makes you wonder, when faced with the downfall of your greatest rival, will you choose opportunism or will you choose honor? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.